everyone, and welcome to the Jeff Bullis Show. Today I have with me Joe Keeley. Now, Joe is dialing in from Minnesota, where the winter is impending, whereas we're in Sydney, Australia, and the summer is making its presence felt. So this is what's great about Zoom, is we actually have these chats from all around the world. So Joe is the CEO and co-founder of Justifi, which is a venture-backed business providing payments and fintech infrastructure for software as a service platforms. And previously, Joe founded College Nannies and Sitters, the nation's largest resource for customized nanny, sitter, and tutoring services, which he exited and has now moved on to starting Justifi. So Joe is passionate about building revolutionary companies and encouraging the growth of education, arts, and entrepreneurship. So welcome to the show, Joe. It's great to have you here.
Oh, great to be here. Thank you so much. And I'm very jealous of the sunshine down in Australia, but you know,
well, it wouldn't have been.
Somebody's got to live here, you know.
Yeah, I know. So it's we need to make sure the planet's balanced. So we've got things happening on the different sides of the world.
That's right.
Yeah. So obviously we're very balanced today. So Joe, you went and did a BA. And then you went to MIT and did a degree as well. But when did your entrepreneurial journey start? And was there an inspiration point? Was it over a beer? Was it, how did you said, I want to start a business? How did that happen?
Well, I grew up in a small rural town where, you know, there was entrepreneurs in hindsight all around me, but no one really called themselves that. Maybe it was too, you know, it was a farming community. Maybe, you know, entrepreneur was too fancy of a French word or something that, and it wasn't quite in vogue. So when I started College Nannies while I was an undergraduate university student, and I started it not over a beer, but perhaps to get beer money. It wasn't like, it was just sort of a way to make a buck to start. And I think that's really important because I know I found it frustrating or maybe a little, you know, like unbelievable in a negative way, or maybe there was something wrong with me when I eventually would start trying to become a student of entrepreneurship, go to speakers, and they would say, oh, we had this idea, and they'd sort of, and then we, you know, got together in our garage, and then poof, you know, they had a public company at the end of the road, and they'd skip over all the hard parts, you know. And for me, I was a reluctant entrepreneur. I wasn't thinking, you know, now's a great time to start, you know, the largest employer of nannies and babysitters, you know, in the country. That was in my first go round. It was simply like, I had a summer job. I was an ice hockey player in university, and some parents asked me to work for their family. And then other parents said, could you find me someone to watch my kids? And they said, we pay you. I'm like, okay, sounds great. And I think, you know, today's terms around starting a side hustle or, you know, those sort of things, sometimes it's not so deliberate and sometimes it's not all that well planned out. But like many things, you know, it takes a while for, you know, things to percolate, and it takes a while to, you know, one step leads you to another. So I was very much a reluctant entrepreneur when I started, and then evolved over time.
Yeah. That's not an unusual story. Like, I think even the Airbnb founders just wanted to have money for beer, just like you mentioned. Maybe that was what you were after, and rented out their a room in their house, or actually just a sofa, I think it was, and then ended up being one of the biggest. It was actually the biggest hotel system in the world, basically, but virtual. So it sounds like you did much the same. So you started as a side hustle, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and so I started just simply with a simple idea to, you know, respond to what some parents were looking for, and saying, you know, looking for someone, in this instance, it was a college athlete, to be a role model for their children for the summer. So College Summer Nannies was born. And then I got kind of sort of sucked into the entrepreneurship department at my university. And they did what they're supposed to do, is provide structure and say, oh, this could be a really great business. And I said, no, 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 that's not what it is. I mean, because after all, you get good test scores to get into college, and you go to college to get a job, and you get a job. So you don't end up moving back in your parents' basement, I suppose. But, I was on this sort of trajectory that was very traditional. It was, you take the steps. So this idea of, starting a business, becoming an entrepreneur as a chosen career path, is maybe it's more in vogue today, but when I was doing it was still very, very unconventional. But lo and behold, I put one foot in front of the other, and then the great thing about having a business while you're a university student is that the bar's really low. Actually, anything you do above and beyond eating cold pizza and showing up for class is sort of viewed as extraordinary. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to go into formal, the entrepreneurship education program. That's what I was my major after this. I was a reluctant entrepreneur, and then lo and behold, there I was. And then I was able to get a lot of press for the business initially because of that bar being low. I won some awards, and it did exactly what it was supposed to do, in that when I was about to graduate, I had a decision to make. Do I go down that road and take that corporate job, or do I continue on with this side hustle that had become a school project that had now started to become maybe a real business? And I'm not really sure what real business means. I think it was a real business from the beginning when one engaged in commerce, but a business, I guess, that could support me and have some sort of future. So that was a very, very challenging time, in so much as it got real when you went outside of the safety of the quad of the university and said, I'm going to do this full time. And I think for me, what was real about it in hindsight, and this was long time ago, wasn't necessarily the fear of not being able to, put food on the table or something. Because let's be honest, at 22, my table wasn't really full. I didn't, it was just beer and burritos I needed to pay for. Unlike the risk, I think, of some folks who start a business and leave a job and have a family to support. But what was more unnerving for me was the idea of, well, if I go do this for real outside of the safety of being a student, what happens if it fails? And I think we all have ego. I had plenty of it. And it was, I didn't want to fail. So, but it was that fear that I would say not only almost stopped me from not doing it, but then propelled me forward. And I do think, and there's been, I think there's a book out there that talks about the gift of fear. And when you apply the gift of fear to the entrepreneurial environment, it can be a tremendous motivator, as long as it's not, debilitating. So that really started a new chapter when I left school.
Yeah, fear can be a motivator. It can also be it can also create paralysis. So
yes,
yeah. Now the other thing I'm curious about is how big was your business plan when you started?
The business plan?
Did you write a business plan when you started?
Well, sure. Actually, when I first started, there wasn't one. But then because I started this inside of the halls of a university and an entrepreneurship program, I got to use it as my project. Right. So my senior capstone project was to write a business plan. And I just wrote it on this project, this business that I had already started. Yeah. And it was... the original plan was I could add some services and I'd have to go dust it off, but maybe expand and get it to a certain size. Yeah. It started to contemplate, well, is this a repeatable service? Is this a product that could be used in other markets? I was in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis-St. Paul, Minnesota, and And so I went out and I needed to think bigger is what I think in hindsight. But ultimately for me, and then that's not for everyone, but at that moment, it was about, can I create this so that it's something that can be repeated? And over the next 10 years of running the business, I would say that my real education actually began.
Yeah.
Or my second education.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is where I suppose the amateur entrepreneur who started something almost by accident, that didn't write a plan, but then said, okay, this is getting a little bit serious. I need to write a proper business plan now. And then the other things that obviously start to come into the equation is, if you're going to scale this, you need systems and processes, don't you?
Right, right. And fortunately, again, I had a lot of guidance by necessity in my classes that I took on how to write a business plan, and I took some franchising classes. So now I started to say, okay, if I'm going to do this full time and real out in the wild as a, full blown sort of quote adult, then, I'm going to have to make a go of it. And if I do that, my aspiration was not to, run a single person nanny agency, as a former ice hockey player. It's like, this isn't what one aspired to do. When I was little, I thought I'd, play in the NHL or something. And it turns out I'm too short, not good enough for that. So that is when I did start putting those systems and processes in place. So I took a franchising approach to this. And what we did is say, well, if our purpose as a company was to build stronger families, and we do that by providing role models that happen to be nannies, babysitters, and tutors, and if that exists in the Twin Cities, then certainly that need exists in Houston and New York and Sydney and London and all over the world. So, but how can one take what is working in one place and replicate it out? Well, fortunately, there are a lot of ways to do that. Primarily but it all requires systems and processes. Yeah. So I decided, with the lack of capital that I had personally, and I wasn't sort of open to the idea of raising, copious amounts of investor capital, that franchising was the way to go. In other words, we would go and find someone who had the same passion and saw the need, and then put together those systems and processes and teach them. So now all of a sudden, the business I was in was not running necessarily a, childcare operation. It was running a business that was teaching other people how to start, run, and grow a business. It just happened to be in the childcare business, but that's what really franchising is. So that was really the next phase of this journey.
Yeah. So franchising was your growth model to help, and that also helped fund it.
That's right. Help fund it and help expand it, because the franchising model is, if you have those systems and processes and brand and a concept, because a lot of people who want to become an entrepreneur, want to run their own business, may not have the idea or the spark to get started, but they are pretty good operators. So we started franchising and started replicating this across the country, and then it was sort of another aha moment that came along, which is, okay, well, we have systems and processes, systems in terms of like, how are things done, but that's when we started working on technology in the business, systems in like technology systems that will help grow each of these businesses in a more scalable fashion. Because, being in the staffing business, that's largely what, this childcare business you can only grow as equal the number of people that you have and the management labor that you can leverage. So we started building out our own vertical software platform. That was allowing these franchises to do their work better and faster, right? And then we built out an iOS and Android native mobile apps that took all of what ended up being 10,000 babysitters that were in our system, that were screened and trained and available. And we got all of their availability real time, and we matched that with parents so that they could book a sitter anytime, anywhere. And that's really when I would say I learned the difference between growth and scale.
Right.
right? Growth is when you add another few people and you grow incrementally to that. But scale is when it grows exponentially beyond just, that next 1 foot in front of the other.
So what you're trying to do with the software is trying to remove friction, so it made it easy for both sides of the equation. In other words, for people that wanted sitters and the sitters themselves, did both use an app? Is that what it ended up
Yeah,
being?
that's right.
Yep.
It is. And mind you, when I first started this business in college, I went out and got my, very first cell phone that actually had an antenna that popped up. So it wasn't
Oh, yeah.
like this was obvious. There was a journey. This was over the last 2 decades. So, it's sort of obvious today that one would insert technology to bridge together a supply and demand. I mean, we can look countless businesses that have done that, but that was really the key to unlocking at the time an X factor where we would have 10x the sort of advantage over someone who didn't have that piece of technology, our competitors, and will bring 10x the amount of utility to our customers and to our role models who are working for us. So that was really pivotal, to understand on the journey. And then as we looked to, we continued to grow. We had a couple hundred locations, 10,000 people across the US. And we had a partner in a public company that was in the childcare, corporate sponsored childcare business. And ultimately, it came a point where our network and our technology there was some amount of friction in how we can continue to work together. And naturally, typically the big public company buys the smaller entrepreneurial company. And that's what happened with us as well. So that was in 2016 when we sold to Bright Horizons Family Solutions, actually.
All right. So I just want to go back quickly to the X factor you mentioned, which was using an app for both sides of the market, the nannies and tutors, and also the people that needed them. So what year was it? Because this is what's interesting about the smartphone. The smartphone didn't start with an app store idea. The app came along afterwards. And Steve Jobs, with the Apple iPhone, democratized what was previously an elite tool, which was the BlackBerry. So what year did you implement your app? I'd be interested by what year that was. Can you remember?
Yeah, it was around 20. The idea was sparked sort of around 2012, 2011 to 2013, somewhere thereabouts. I remember when it happened. I was actually sitting on the couch talking to my wife. We had 2 children, one who was very, very young. And I said, I have to go to Chicago tomorrow. And she said, well, our primary school daughter, she has something at school that I need to go to. Who's going to watch, the baby? And I was sitting there thinking, like, I'll shoot an email to one of my offices to see if we can get a sitter over here. And I'm thinking, at present, I'm the leader of the largest employer of, babysitters in, this city and beyond. How come this is so difficult?
Yeah.
This is like the shoemaker's kids have no shoes. So then I went to Chicago and I was talking to someone in the industry I had a meeting with, and I was telling him my vision of being able to hook up, the need that I so, desperately was experiencing as a parent. And then, all of this network of high quality role models, our nannies, our babysitters. And this gentleman said, well, it's like Uber. And at the time, Uber was new. It had just gone from San Francisco to Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only black cars, if you remember, when it first started.
Yep.
So he dialed up his phone and he ordered a black car. We got in it. We went to lunch, and it was the closest thing to magic that I'd ever experienced. I'm like, yes, like Uber. That's what we're trying to do. So, we immediately started really, working and studying the space. And it was really same. It's about linking supply and demand. In our instance, it was a closed loop system because we needed to screen and train these caregivers. But the thing about X factors in a business is that X factors have an expiration date. You don't know when that expiration date is, but but they all have them. So it's about identifying what makes your company, service, product, etc., have a 10x advantage over someone else. And then once you find that, recognize that it's fleeting and, run like heck to take advantage of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the app industry is revolutionized business. It really, really has. And in fact, the smartphone was the start of that. And I remember my partner back in 2009, we woke up one morning and she pulled out a phone. She said, "I'm in love." And I went, "Oh, thanks, honey." And she said, "No, I mean the phone."
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. She was in awe of what the Apple phone did. And I remember that was about 2000. It was 2009. But you mentioned that the app, you didn't implement it to 2012. So the Apple
Yeah,
Store,
something like that. Yeah.
yeah. Well, the Apple Store, the App Store certainly wasn't on the horizon back when Apple launched. So it's fascinating. All right, so let's fast forward. You got your app kicking goals. You've removed friction. You made it easy for your customers to actually order a nanny or a tutor. So what happened in terms of, did someone turn up and say, "Look, we're interested in buying your business," or did you go looking? How did the exit happen?
Sure. Well, we were a very material supplier for a large public company that was offering corporate benefits in childcare. So they operate operates in the U.S., Europe, and I believe just entered Australia as well. So they offer childcare centers, nurseries, and they also they provide corporate backup care. So if you can't get to work today because one of the million reasons why you might not be able to with children, if you work for oftentimes a large company, Microsoft, Goldman Sachs, someone like that, they will pay for a certain number of days to have a childcare provider come into the home. And we were not only the lion's share of the volume, we were a strategic partner with them, but our technology was enabling a lot of things. So we got uncomfortably big in terms of a supply chain for them and bringing innovation in, and we had a great relationship with them. So there came a moment in 2015 or so where they decided internally that this partner of theirs, us, would be better off if it was internal than external. So that began the discussions and the process to go through of ultimately selling the company in July of 2016. I then stayed on for what ended up being 3 years as part of an earnout, and I did a project in the UK and taking our technology. So that was the journey. And interestingly enough, from when I started it, it was a little poetic, perhaps, like, a lot of people talk about starting their businesses like their baby, and when I ultimately left from, starting of the company as a university student to exiting after the earnout, it was just over 18 years. So it was a little bit poetic, like I had launched a child, birthed a child, launched a child off to college, and there they were out in the world. So that's how the exit came to be.
And you were ready.
I think so. I think I was ready, and I went. There was definitely a goal that I wanted to. Once I got through the university process and reluctant entrepreneur process, and said, "Okay, I'm going to do this," and then I wanted to scale something, and then I sort of learned and tripped through the woods, in the dark, so to speak. I definitely wanted to finish what I would call the full cycle of entrepreneurship. So the start, the founding, the starting, the middle, and then the exit, and exiting it hopefully in a good way that not only was good for all shareholders, myself included, but all stakeholders also, because we had a lot of franchisees that weren't shareholders in the company we sold, but were stakeholders in the brand and how we did things. And I felt like we found a terrific long-term, high-quality operator with alignment of values. And then I was sort of faced with, what sounds like a great problem, which was, now what? What do you do with yourself after you sell a company and, you're in your mid-30s?
Yeah. And that was going to be my next question.
Okay.
Yeah. So you've sold the company, you've done the earn out, the old golden handcuffs,
Right.
Yep. And so, how did Justifi, the your fintech company, where did that idea come from? Was it because you observed some issues regarding, challenges at your previous company in terms of getting payments, for example, and the cost of those payments? Because in the past, you had banks to make payments, and you had to turn up with checks and everything, and then PayPal came along and sort of like global and digital made it easier. So where did the
Hmm.
idea for starting Justifi come from?
Uh, the original idea for Justify came from somebody else. It wasn't my idea. And I didn't start it alone. I started it with partners. But before that, I took a year off. I took a sabbatical, and it happened to coincide with about half of it or so coincided with, the launch of, the global pandemic. And the pandemic was, there's so many negative things, and it was a tragedy for sure. For me personally, once my family was safe and everything, it did provide a utility for me, in so much as there was a lot of sort of anxiety about, okay, now that I'm not working, that sounds great, it's what I wanted, but then, what am I going to do? And, how do I stay relevant? And, being an entrepreneur, it isn't exactly like you go into the classified ads and look up, jobs or something. Not, I didn't need one, but it is really challenging to go from, running a company to then not. But what the pandemic did is it stopped everything.
Mm.
And it turns out, if there's no deals to be looked at, or if there's no lunches to miss because no restaurants are open, your FOMO goes away pretty quickly. So
Mm-hmm.
that was helpful for me. And what I did during that time is ultimately reflect back on my first 18 years of an entrepreneurial journey and start dissecting, well, what was I good at? What did I like about that? What did I not like about that? How would I rank what parts of that were a success or maybe less of a success? And what I came up with for myself is, number one, I needed to engage in meaningful work. And not just because, I was driving everyone at my house crazy, which might be true, but because that is part of me. And, when you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it wasn't about, shelter or putting food on the table, but it was about sort of self-actualization and engaging in things. So I recognized that I needed to go out and do something and engage in that and do something meaningful. Number two, well, then what did I do? And I started analyzing what I really liked the most and what created value. At scale in my last company was really, once I started tapping into a larger market and when I started leveraging technology. So
Mm-hmm.
when I went out and started entertaining opportunities to buy, to invest, to start, I was looking at it through a lens of a matrix I put together, and I wanted to find the biggest industry I could, and I wanted to be able to lead and do something innovative, and I wanted to do it with technology.
Mm-hmm.
So when some friends of mine who started a vertical SaaS platform, a sports tech platform that actually made, their economic model was really to process payments, they're a fintech company inside of a software company. And I had read, and although I didn't fully appreciate or understand the power of how software companies can actually become fintech companies or financial technology companies, and they said we had a tremendous exit. They grew. They were processing over $4 billion a year. They had built this software and were acquired by a public company for nearly $1 billion. And they said that's a great ending. And I said, yeah, that was a very good ending. However, it took them a decade and a half, and it was really complicated and really expensive. And they said it doesn't need to be this way. In fact, we have a playbook, and we know how to do this for other software companies. So that really checked almost all the boxes of the things that got me excited and that I wanted to do. So we started getting together and whiteboarding out and talking about, what was wrong with some of the, the finance and the payment industry as it relates to small business and other software companies, and how might we fix it? In other words, I was there learning, but also looking for the X factor, because I knew in my self-reflection that if you can align the right people and the right purpose and have an X factor, you're going to set yourself up, certainly not for a guarantee of success, but you might dramatically increase the likelihood.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the whole online payment area, and on a small scale, I've got a small company, but paying people all around the world. PayPal take a lot of fees, banks take a lot of fees, they hide exchange rates and they take a little skim off that. Actually, sometimes not a little
That's
skim,
right.
but a big skim. So, and then the other challenge comes also is like, okay, so this person wants it paid this way, this person wants to be paid that way, and it starts to get complicated. So, with Justifi, what big problem do you solve, or what problems do you solve um, in that space? Because I am fascinated by it, because I'm seeing the fragmentation of the finance industry as well. Um, so, what big problem or problems does Justifi solve?
Yes. So simply put, we help vertical SaaS or software as a service platforms make the most money on their funds flow possible. So let me break that down for you a little bit. So
Hmm.
first of all, vertical SaaS, software as a service, these are platforms that serve other businesses. When we talked about, there's a lot of famous quotes from, Andreessen Horowitz, the famous venture capital firm, and they talk about, first software is eating the world. Okay, well, what they're saying there is that software is coming in and being the system of record for small businesses all around the world.
Yep.
So barbershops use a software platform, and dry cleaners use a software platform, and youth sports organizations use a software platform. So we help those software platforms achieve the next buzzword that's out there, which is every company is going to be a fintech company. Okay, well, what does that mean? Financial technology. It means that these platforms oftentimes receive a fee for use of their software. That makes sense. But the greater value in their platform is actually monetizing all the transactions that happen inside or around their platform. So, for example, if I'm running, a platform and I provide payments to my small business as a feature. So if you want to collect payments on your platform, structuring the infrastructure that they can make money on the flow. So you talk about the little skim. We essentially help vertical SaaS platforms take a little skim off the payments and provide that service. And then we allow them to provide loans to the businesses that are on their platforms and offer insurance and do all of these sort of fintech playbook, because ultimately, in many, many cases, becoming a fintech company inside of a platform is exponentially more valuable than actually selling the software to those customers itself. So really, when you think about the business they're in is providing a great software platform, but the economic engine that they're leveraging is a fintech engine.
Right.
So that's what we do.
So you provide a fintech plug-on to vertical SaaS platforms. Is that
That's right.
correct?
So that is, and we do it in a variety of different ways, but ultimately we build infrastructure, and we have a engaged fintech team, a tech-enabled services team that comes in and helps them, because, most platform operators are really passionate, really knowledgeable about the vertical they're in.
Yeah.
My family was in the roofing business and we build roofing software. My family was in, I had experience in the childcare space. We built a childcare software. But and then they have a board member or investor that says, you ought to be a fintech company, because I read it somewhere and I have some ideas on how you're going to do that. But the truth is that it is complicated and it is expensive, and the wrong infrastructure decision or the wrong, partner decision can end up, costing them down the road. So having gone through it ourselves, having built companies ourselves, we said, well, if we could redo all of that journey and do it in a way that helps level the playing field. And that's why we've chosen, Justifi as a name. It's provocative on purpose, that we think that that it could be a little democratized. It could be a little bit more fair. So we service vertical SaaS platforms, and we help them win and achieve the greatest amount of value out of their ecosystem as they can through a fintech lens.
Right. That's very, very cool. Now, the question I have there is, did you have to get a banking license to start Justifi, or is the banking payment system, is that back end into a wholesale bank of some type, or?
We are not a bank, but we have built an orchestration layer that allows us to link into multiple banks,
Right.
multiple acquirers, multiple lenders, multiple card issuers. So we can bring and orchestrate the power of all these folks who are world class at what they do. We are the best at sort of coming in and being that partner for vertical SaaS to make all of that work.
Right. So, because there's been quite a lot of emergent payment systems that have come out, like Square,
Sure.
PayPal's been around for a long time, and maybe was
Yep.
the only one to use to do. But now PayPal seems to be increasing its fees, and transparency seems to be disappearing a little bit as well. What are some of the emerging players that in the financial payments area globally that you think are making a difference?
Well, certainly I think the leading bleeding edge that folks are talking about is, Bitcoin and blockchain and crypto, all the like. And that's certainly true. But I would say that, the most recent juggernaut is Stripe. And in many cases, we compete with Stripe for platform business, the Stripe Connect product. But what they solved was for e-commerce being able to spin up and collect payments without having to talk. They sold mostly to developers without having to talk to anyone at 11 o'clock at night.
Right.
So you have, the Squares and the PayPals, and then the next generation is Stripe. And we think that we're bringing something unique specifically to platforms by orchestrating things out there. But I think that this goes back to sort of the reflections I had from when I had my halftime between my entrepreneurial ventures. And that is the good thing about this industry, and there's lots of other industries like this as well, is that it's not a zero-sum game. You can be, competitors and partners at the same time, because there is few industries that are as large as the global payments and money flow fintech business. So there's so much room for nuance, in serving what one does in this space.
Yeah, it's certainly a big market, and also I suppose, that's the other challenge that comes with a big market like that is regulation. Is that a challenge for the business?
Sure. I mean, one needs to be, whenever you're dealing with, OPM, which is other people's money,
Okay.
there, and you're moving that money perhaps, in different currencies and across borders and things like that, there's a lot of regulation. So, but that's part of the complication, that if we can solve that for a platform who's focused on their specific vertical with their product, that's when you can really bring value. And so, I think it's important. When I started my first business, I was able to bootstrap this, and I had some bank loans and some other things over time. But by and large, it was not fueled by investor capital. We franchised, which was a source of capital through expansion. This business cannot. It is not going to be possible to bootstrap this business because of the regulation, because the bar that you must meet in order to simply process OPM or other people's money. So that's why I was also attracted to starting this with my partners, because on my own entrepreneurial journey, before I started a company, literally a service company out of my dorm room, this one, we raised venture capital, about $13.5 million from day one, because we knew that we needed to hire very expensive, very talented engineers. And we knew we needed to, become world-class in order to even have a seat at the table, let alone to, have the right to provide a proposal to someone.
Yeah. So, and that's that becomes part of the challenge too, is that you can get a bucket of money, but sometimes too much money can be wasted on expensive offices and things like that, rather than actually being spent frugally and carefully. So your initial raise was what, 18 million? Is that correct?
13 and a half.
13 and a half. Okay, cool. And you started this, and you started Justifi back in 2000, and when was that? 19?
We started getting together in 2020, but we launched it in 21, January of 21.
Okay, right. You think the
So we're
timing?
just approaching 2 years.
Okay. So how was the timing in the middle of the pandemic work for you? Is it good timing?
I think there is no worse time and no better time to start a business anytime. And that is, it just sort of is what it is. At this point, our eyes were wide open because the world had now at least understood a little bit about what we were in.
Mm.
There wasn't an expectation that anyone was coming to the office, so we were able to start up. And by and large, we started this with folks that all had 10 to 15-year experience in this space. So we were able to go, pretty quickly with some real talented people out of the gate. But then, shortly thereafter, a year after, the variant started settling down, and we were able to then open up an office where I'm sitting today, which was much more of a hybrid first environment. It's almost like our own co-working space. So in that regard, it was a benefit because we were already sort of know what we were in, and it didn't catch us by surprise.
Yeah. So that raises another few questions for me. Number one is, what have been some of your biggest challenges in your entrepreneurial journey that have hit you around the head, or raised fear and given you sleepless nights? What are some of the biggest challenges you've had along the way, Joe?
Sure. I think that, when I think back to the biggest challenges, of course, are the ones that you often learn from in hindsight the most. They might be the most painful at the time, like that school teacher that was, such a stickler, but then you look back and lo and behold, your favorite teacher was that one that was the hardest. So I would say understanding the nuance between management and leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So what franchising as a mechanism in my first half of my career and entrepreneurial journey, many times franchisees say, I'm going to go start my own business. They buy a franchise and they start their own business because they don't want to work for someone else. But a franchise has rules and agreements. So very quickly I learned, like, oh, someone's coming to this, wanting to run their own business and call their shot and stick it to the man. And suddenly I was the man. And that wasn't going to work out very well if I treated them as if they were,
Employees.
I couldn't fire them.
Yep.
That's right. And so they don't have to listen to you. And in fact, they were predisposed not to listen to things. So I had to really draw on some of my experience in sport and leading, and that, franchising was one of the greatest lessons and truest forms of leadership that I experienced. And by hopefully, mastering it more days than I didn't, I was able to, lead and grow and get, otherwise reluctant sort of team members to follow. And it's a lot more difficult to do that when you don't have paycheck authority. And so being able to, sort that out and then apply that to growing this company, because at the end of the day, very, very few people want to be managed, but many want to be led.
Right. Yes. And you want to feel that they're part of a team and a greater vision.
For sure.
Yeah. So Justify's been running what, just over a year now formally? Is that
Yeah,
correct?
couple of years. Yep.
Okay, couple of years. So what's the plan for world domination?
Well, we have achieved really, really great traction. We have dozens of vertical SaaS platforms that our purpose is to accelerate potential. and we are helping those platforms accelerate potential, and specifically their fintech potential. So, we're growing pretty rapidly. We have another year where we'll continue at this fundraising stage, and then we'll go out for our Series A, and so we're going to keep on growing, keep on expanding the potential that, and bringing in other partners to help those vertical SaaS platforms do more good in the world that they do, which is effectively enabling small and medium-sized businesses to serve their customers. So it's really continue to do good work and bring more value to them, and then we think good things are going to happen.
Well, and the really good thing about the world we live in today, the digital world, the global digital world, is that your market's not restricted to a location or a region. It's actually global, and that's where it gets rather exciting, isn't it? So
it is.
Yeah,
it is. And when I look back, and we're a couple of years in from making that transition from my first stage of my journey, sabbatical, to my next, time will tell to see what the last half of the book is written on the journeys. But I think so far so good, in so much as I had the blessing to be deliberate about that next phase, and we're having a blast.
Yeah. And it's really fascinating too that we've heard a lot about the Great Resignation in terms of people leaving their jobs, but I think what you had was the Great Reflection.
That's right. That's right. and I think that it was a luxury to be able to do it. I would encourage others to attempt to, even if it's an afternoon, once a quarter or once a year, to just sort of stop and reflect. And maybe you have a personal business plan, maybe you don't. I would encourage you to do so. And maybe it's not a business plan, but more of a life plan. But am I doing the type of work I want to be doing with the type of people I want to be doing it with? Yep. And is it give me energy? And I think if it's not as easy for everyone to just pull anchor and do something else.
No, it's not.
But it is typically easy to start thinking about it.
Yep.
And that is the first step towards that journey. So it's been a pleasure.
That's great. And I remember someone I chatted to who started a business at college as a side hustle on how to write business plans.
Okay.
I interviewed an American entrepreneur who did start a side hustle, how to write business plans, because he found out he was actually quite good at them. And asked him, so how would you write a business plan? And one of the things he mentioned, which is really fascinating, he said, sit down. Okay, so write in one sentence what your business is about. So can you basically in one sentence describe what your business does? And he said the other thing then you need to do is then sit down and work out, why am I uniquely qualified to do this? And that, I did that for a recent business startup I'm involved with. And I sat down, I wrote down 10 things why I was uniquely qualified. And then it really helped me define what I wanted to do. That just writing, that was really powerful. And I think I wrote 10 things down why I was uniquely qualified. And that then also comes from strength rather than weakness. And I think basically it sounds like that's what you did, in that you had time for the great reflection and you wrote down, what did I love about it? What did I hate about the past things I did? And what do I want to do in the future? In other words, you took the time to actually think and ask questions, which often isn't done.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think we're often, life is busy, whether it's, work, kids, other family, friends, obligation, it's you sort of put one foot in front of the other. But I think that, and also reflecting what you hear about all these businesses that fail and such a low percentage that succeed. Well, what makes them successful or not so successful? And I think that when I looked back and to say, that is why some of the things, both what am I uniquely qualified to do, but But when I talk about looking at something with the size of the market, how fast is it growing? Is there a single winner, a winner take all, or can there be multiple winners?
Mm-hmm.
These were all attributes that went into essentially a matrix of our own rating and opportunities that would come my way.
Yeah. And that raises a couple of things that I find fascinating, especially for startups in the technology space, is that there's two battles going on. The one battle which you're in a race for is market share. Can I dominate the industry?
Mm-hmm.
Number two, the other race, which you learned along the way, is a technology race. In other words, can I develop technology that's going to make a difference and make me stand out from my competitors? Is that they two things that cross your mind regularly, and the leadership team? In other words, how do we dominate a market, and how do we keep investing in tech? And as a little aside, Facebook with Metaverse is trying to basically dominate technology, and are spending, I think, $30 billion is on capex for R&D, which is just astonishing. So those two areas, in other words, how can I dominate my market? And number two, how can I continue to invest in my technology so it will help me dominate the market? So there's actually two battles going on from my reflection on what tech startups are in a war for.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a function of really spending some time on each one of those in a detailed fashion. So like when I say, how do I dominate my market? Well, first you have to define what your market is.
Yep.
And I think that the more narrowly defined that you can have it, mm-hmm. while still being a big enough TAM, or total addressable market, the better. Because then that will lead you to, it's not just building technology for technology's sake, but how can your technology, be new, different, better, faster, less expensive, whatever it happens to be? Because that's what's, I think, really, really exciting, particularly for entrepreneurs today, is that never before has it been easier or more accessible for even a solo individual or a small team to go head to head in a market against, very, very large companies, because of the accessibility of technology. What you needed to buy expensive servers before, and now you can spin up, AWS or Azure in your, in the cloud. You needed to go through all these banking licenses and payment infrastructure, becoming a payment facilitator. And now you can use someone, like Justifi to provide all that infrastructure, as well as the fintech team. So, there are different ways of doing that, and you don't need to build it all yourself.
No. And I think you just hit something that's really important, and that's the democratization. Software has enabled, it's never been easier or faster and cheaper to actually start a business. What you're doing is you're democratizing fintech for vertical SaaS companies, essentially. So, and not only that, you're adding value by giving something back, by allowing them to actually make more money on other services wrapped around that, which is very, very cool. So, just to wrap it up, Joe, what are 2 or 3 top tips you would like to share with other wannabe entrepreneurs who are maybe about to start, people that want to start a side hustle, or entrepreneurs that are already in the middle of the battle? So what are 2 or 3 top tips, business tips, that you would like to share with our audience?
I would say that really narrowing in on why you're doing what you're doing, or your why. In my first company, it was our purpose as an organization was to build stronger families.
Right.
And our purpose at Justifi is to accelerate the potential, or accelerate potential of vertical SaaS companies. So understanding your purpose and then letting things flow from there is sort of number one. I have found it to be one of the greatest ways to attract customers, employees that you want, right? Because it's authentic and it's like a magnet.
Yep.
2, then once you have that, identify and articulate the values in your organization that you have and you want to have around you. Because and these aren't just the permission to play values like honesty, integrity. They're more like,
Yeah.
we want to be committed partners. We want to be, undaunted problem solvers. And the reason is that not every, although it doesn't feel like it in the beginning, not every employee, not every customer is going to be a good fit. So
No.
you need to have a way to filter out, those that aren't, and filter in those that are. So, if you start with a purpose and then you have a few simple rules, and that is how we conduct ourselves in our core values, the right answers start coming after that. And then whether it's personally, professionally, what we talked about, I would say, is what's been helpful for me is, taking a little bit of time periodically. And I think, it could be quarterly, annually, and taking stock in, where am I today? Where do I want to be? And what needs to happen for that to happen? Mm-hmm. Those are the three most important questions in strategy. Mm-hmm. You don't have to have all the answers. In fact, you won't have all the answers.
You won't, no.
But if you can have the right three questions, I've found that you'll, do better more often than not.
Mm. I think there's some real words of wisdom there. And thank you very much, Joe, for sharing your story. It's quite an amazing story. And I think that I look forward to seeing Justifi grow, and I'll be keeping an eye on it. So, and thank you very much for your wisdom. What I love about doing the podcast is actually sitting down with some of the smartest people in the world, entrepreneurs. I love the creativity. Where does this idea come from? And also then their courage to step into the gap and do it. I think and thank you very much for sharing your courage and your insights. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you for having me.